This time on Introductory Politics, we move beyond the Bill of Rights and start discussing the additional amendments that are found to the U.S. Constitution. We will start with the 11th Amendment and dealing with lawsuits against states. The 11th Amendment is really an amendment that deals with the federal government, not really with states. Ultimately, what the 11th Amendment is doing is saying that the federal court system, our national court system, is not allowed. They do not have jurisdiction to hear lawsuits from a state where one citizen of one state is suing a different state. And so, for example, if I felt as though the state of Oklahoma violated, say, one of my rights, then I would not be able to sue the state of Oklahoma as a resident of Texas in a federal court. I would have to sue them in a state court. And so this ultimately is what the 11th Amendment it does. It really restricts the types of cases that the federal government, that our federal courts can hear. The 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment changes the process of the selection of president and vice president. When it comes to the 12th Amendment, what it ultimately does is electors in the electoral college would cast one vote for who they wanted to be president. And the president would be the person who received the greatest number of votes, assuming it was more than half. The vice president of the United States would then be the person who essentially came in second place. This oftentimes could mean that the president could be of one political party and the vice president could be of a different political party. So, putting this in the context of, say, maybe some of our more modern candidates. During the 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump wins the presidency by getting more than 50% of the electoral college votes. Without the 12th Amendment, Donald Trump's vice president would have been Kamala Harris because she received the second highest number of electoral college votes. Same thing back in 2020 when Joe Biden wins the majority of the electoral college votes. Donald Trump would have been Joe Biden's vice president. This obviously would create a substantial number of issues, and it did immediately after the ratification of the US Constitution. And so the 12th Amendment was quickly ratified in order to essentially prevent that type of possibility from occurring. So now electors in the Electoral College cast two votes, one vote for president, one vote for vice president. And while it is certainly possible that the second vote, the vote for vice president, could be for someone of a different party, that doesn't happen. And so while possible, it's not really plausible. The 13th Amendment. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are all of our kind of what we traditionally call our post Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment provides for the abolition of slavery. It prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude, except when used as a punishment for a crime for which a person has been duly convicted. The 13th Amendment is quite simple to understand. It is just a blanket ban on all forms of slavery, again, ending the practices of slavery that had been in existence since prior to the Civil War, and ultimately ends slavery for good. However, though, again, there is what we call the exception clause to the 13th Amendment. Again, the 13th Amendment says, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And so, in this instance, what this essentially means is that for individuals who are in prison, they are able to essentially be required to do labor in order to kind of as a part of their prison sentence. And so that technically does kind of by definition count as slavery or count as involuntary servitude, but that exception is carved out in the 13th Amendment to essentially require that prisoners work if they choose to do so. The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is another one of those very substantial amendments, far reaching amendments. When it comes to the 14th Amendment, we're largely talking about equal protection, but there are other rights and other rights that are found in there as well. When it comes to things that are found components of the 14th Amendment, we go back to due process. One of the things that is mentioned here is due process rights and their protection at the state level. When it comes to these due process rights, ultimately what the 14th Amendment is doing is going through a process of incorporation. Incorporation is the application of federal rights to the states. And so, take for example, the First Amendment says that Congress shall not respect an establishment of religion, abridge the freedom of speech, etc. It may say specific reference to Congress, which means that the protections that the US Constitution gives us when it comes, say, to freedom of speech, that only applies to, say, federal law enforcement. Congress cannot restrict our speech. The federal government, the FBI, cannot arrest you for some type of speech. Incorporation is taking those rights that apply at the federal level and applying it to the states. So not only does Congress are they not allowed to to recognize an establishment of religion, state governments are also not allowed to do the same thing. And so it expands the scope of who is not allowed to, say, abridge the freedom of speech. Incorporation happens here. The Bill of Rights, incorporation of the Bill of Rights essentially occurs here in the 14th Amendment. The incorporation of due process rights occurs specifically here in the 14th Amendment, those kinds of elements. We also end up with questions, not necessarily questions, but clauses related to citizenship. The idea of birthright citizenship is essentially articulated here in the 14th Amendment. When it comes to citizenship, what the 14th Amendment says is that essentially, if you could be considered a citizen in one state, you could be considered a citizen in all states. And so this essentially takes the language of citizenship out of the idea of being a state level citizen. You're not a Georgia citizen or a Texas citizen. You are a US citizen. This particular language, again, also helps establish this idea of birthright citizenship. So, this part of the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And so, this is where this idea of kind of birthright citizenship is established. If you are born in the United States, you are certainly going to be a US citizen. The last major part of the 14th Amendment, which is largely the most complicated part, is going to be the issue of equal protection. When it comes to equal protection, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is going to say that essentially all laws are to be applied equally to all persons. And so when it comes to that, we're ultimately talking about how the law, or sorry, how the government is not allowed to make distinctions among people when it comes to the application of law. This is largely going to be a conversation on discrimination. And so when we think about is the law engaging, is a particular law racially discriminatory? There are ways for the courts to handle that, and that is some of what we're going to be talking about when it comes to racial discrimination, sex discrimination. How does the court answer the question of has discrimination occurred? The 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment to the US Constitution is going to be the first to talk about suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote, and the 15th Amendment makes it plainly clear that when it comes to the right to vote, this cannot be abridged on the basis of race. And so this essentially means that there is no way to exclude people from voting simply because they belong to one particular race.